Please like this video. I really need your support right now. It's the only way this story can reach more people. Thank you so much for being here with me and for your support. I still remember the exact drive home that night. It was late October 2021, one of those evenings in the suburbs outside Columbus where the temperature drops fast and the streetlights cast that orange haze that makes everything look slightly unreal. I had my hands on the wheel, the heat turned up too high, and I just kept driving for maybe 10 minutes past my apartment before I realized I'd missed my exit. I wasn't crying. I wasn't even angry yet. I was just replaying the same moment over and over, the way you replay something you're not entirely sure you witnessed correctly. I had just watched my father smile while a man publicly dismantled everything I had spent 3 years building. And the strange thing is, the smile is what did it. Not the words, not the laughter around the table, the smile, because it wasn't nervous or polite or uncomfortable. It was easy, relaxed. The smile of someone who found the moment perfectly fine. There are things that split your understanding of a relationship in two, a before and an after, and they almost never announce themselves loudly. They happen quietly, at a dinner table, on an ordinary Tuesday. When someone you love makes a small choice, and you watch them make it, and you know, even as you're sitting there holding a glass of water, trying to keep your face still, that you are going to be processing what you just saw for a very long time. I want to tell you what happened. All of it. Not to perform anything, and not because I've made complete peace with every part of it. I'm not sure peace is exactly the right word. I want to tell it because if you hear the way it actually unfolded, you might recognize something in it. Maybe something about your own family. Maybe something about the gap between who the people who love you are supposed to be and who they actually turn out to be when the room gets uncomfortable. I grew up in the kind of household where appearance was infrastructure. My father was a man who cared, genuinely, deeply cared about how things looked from the outside. Not in a shallow or vain way exactly. It was more deeply wired than that. He had grown up in a mid-sized town in central Ohio where your reputation was your credit, where what the neighbors thought of you had real material consequences, and I think that environment formed him in ways neither of us fully understood until all of this happened. He spent most of his career in commercial real estate. He was good at it. He was good at reading rooms, managing impressions, and knowing instinctively which version of himself to present in any given situation. I watched him do it my whole childhood and thought it was sophistication. Looking back now, I think it was armor. The thing about growing up with a parent like that is you learn to calibrate yourself to them without realizing you're doing it. You figure out which version of yourself earns warmth and which one earns distance. You learn the rules even though nobody states them. By the time I was a teenager, I had a precise sense of what my father found impressive and what made him quietly uncomfortable, and I organized myself accordingly. That's not unusual, a lot of kids do this, but I want to name it because it matters for everything that came later. I had spent years building a relationship with my father around a performance, and neither of us had ever stopped to examine the stage we were performing on. I was 26, living in a one-bedroom apartment in Clintonville, working remotely, and spending most of my evenings building a content platform I had started the year before. It wasn't glamorous. It was a lot of nights at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, writing and editing and researching and publishing, usually not finishing until after midnight. The platform covered personal finance and independent business, the kind of writing I genuinely cared about. I wasn't doing it to become known. I was doing it because I had something to say and I had figured out slowly that people were willing to listen. By the time I was 27, I had built an audience of around 18,000 subscribers. Not enormous, but real. These were people who had given me their email address, which, in the attention economy, means something. They opened the emails, they replied. One woman wrote to say that a piece I'd written about financial identity had helped her finally understand why she kept sabotaging her own savings, and she asked if I'd ever considered coaching. I kept that email in a folder I still have on my laptop. I told my dad about the platform maybe 6 months in. We were at his house in Worthington on a Thursday, just the two of us. He'd made pasta, and I showed him the numbers on my phone. The subscriber count, the open rate, a couple of pieces I was proudest of. He looked at it the way he always looked at things I showed him, attentive, nodding, saying the right things. He said he was proud. He asked a few questions, and then the conversation moved somewhere else. What I didn't register at the time, what I only pieced together much later, was that in the weeks after that dinner, he had started mentioning my platform to other people, not in a protective or celebratory way. More the way you'd mention a curiosity, as though he were testing how people reacted to it, gauging whether it reflected well on him or complicated his image. I didn't know this then. I assembled it afterward from small things people mentioned in passing. Raymond came into the picture around that same period. My father had known him for years through a local business networking group, the kind of semi-formal gathering of professionals in their 50s who meet for lunch once a month and feel important doing so. Raymond was probably 54 at the time. He ran some kind of consultancy that was never very specifically described, and he carried an easy confidence that filled whatever room he was in. He drove a nice car. He had opinions about wine. My dad thought he was sharp, and I think that admiration ran deep precisely because it was wrapped around something my father quietly wished were true about himself. I met Raymond twice before the dinner. Once at a birthday gathering my dad organized, briefly, and once when he stopped by my dad's house on a Saturday morning when I happened to be there. He was charming in person, warm handshake, good eye contact. He asked me one question about my work and then steered the conversation somewhere else before I'd finished answering. I remember thinking, this man is very good at seeming interested without actually being interested. But I filed it away. Maybe I was overthinking it. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing, was that Raymond had been following my platform for months, not publicly. He desubscribed under a name that meant nothing to me, some combination of initials and a number. He'd been reading everything I published. He'd left a few anonymous comments, and at some point he had decided to start taking screenshots. The dinner was a Saturday evening in mid-October. My dad hosted these gatherings maybe 4 or 5 times a year, ostensibly casual, always anything but. He'd set the table formally, invite 8 or 10 people, a mix of professional contacts and old friends, and the evenings had a particular social grammar that everyone followed without being told. You complimented the food. You asked about people's work in ways designed to display your familiarity with it. You were witty but not too pointed. It was a room that rewarded performance. I was sitting next to a woman I didn't know well, across from Raymond, somewhere in the middle of the meal. The main course had come and gone, and we were in that loose, wine-softened territory before dessert, when Raymond turned the conversation toward content creation. He framed it as a general observation about the state of online media. And then, very naturally, very smoothly, he mentioned my platform by name. He said he'd come across it recently. He said it with the tone of someone describing a restaurant that had seemed promising from the outside but hadn't quite delivered. He said the writing was competent but derivative. He said the audience I'd built seemed to respond to simplicity rather than depth, which was, he noted, a perfectly valid strategy if you weren't concerned with being taken seriously. And then he made the joke, something like, anyone can build a following online if they meet people where they are, which is to say, not very far along. A few people laughed, not everyone. The woman next to me gave a small, sideways smile that I think was actually embarrassed. But enough of the table laughed, and the moment carried a social velocity that moved it past before anyone could reconsider it. I looked at my father. He was smiling, relaxed. He looked like a man enjoying his evening. I picked up my glass of water. I thought about the 18,000 people who opened my emails every week. The woman who'd written to me about her savings. The 3 advertising partners I'd spent 4 months cultivating. The cold cups of coffee. The midnight edits. I held the water in my mouth for a moment, then swallowed and finished the evening exactly as I had started it, composed, present, and completely alone in what I was carrying. I drove home the long way. The heat was too high. I missed my exit. I didn't call my dad that night. I wasn't ready to hear what he would say. Some part of me wanted to hold on just a little longer to the possibility that I'd misread the room, that the smile had meant something other than what it looked like, that there was an explanation I hadn't considered yet. I've always found it easier to extend a generous interpretation slightly past what the evidence supports. It's a habit I'm still working on. Then, about 3 days later, the thread appeared. I found out on a Wednesday morning. I was at my kitchen table, coffee still hot for once, opening my laptop just before 7, when I saw an email from a collaborator in the personal finance space. Subject line, wanted you to see this before it spread further. The thread was on a well-trafficked public forum that covered independent media criticism. Raymond had written it under an account with enough posting history to look credible. He deframed it as concerned journalism, an examination of authenticity in independent publishing, using my platform as the central case study. He had screenshots. He had pulled pieces of my writing out of sequence, paired them with commentary, and drawn conclusions that were technically supported by individual sentences while being completely contradicted by their full context. It was, I have to acknowledge, skillfully done. He hadn't fabricated anything outright. He had curated. And selective truth, as I have come to understand, is its own form of dishonesty, arguably more dangerous than an outright lie, because it gives the reader the feeling of having done their own thinking. I read the whole thread. Then I read every comment beneath it. I made a fresh cup of coffee, sat back down, and read it again. I wasn't looking for ammunition. I was trying to understand the structure of what had been built against me, the same way you'd want to understand the architecture of a wall before deciding whether to go through it or around it. By the end of that day, 2 advertising partners had sent me the exact same carefully worded email about needing to reassess the relationship given some concerns that had been raised. A collaborator I'd been working with for 2 months went quiet. No reply to a message he'd normally have answered within hours. And my subscriber numbers, which had been climbing slowly but steadily, went flat. Not a dramatic collapse, just flat, the way water goes still right before something disrupts it. I sat with all of this for 2 more days before I called my father. He picked up on the second ring. My dad is a man who usually makes you wait, not rudely, just long enough that you notice it. The second ring was not his rhythm. That alone told me he'd been thinking about this. That he had been expecting my call and had used the 2 days to prepare what he was going to say. I said his name. He said quietly, "I know about it." I waited, and then he said, "Raymond meant well." I remember exactly where I was standing. In my hallway between the kitchen and the front door, one hand resting against the wall, phone to my ear, wearing a gray sweatshirt I'd had since college. I noticed a small chip in the paint near the light switch, the one I'd been meaning to fix for months. Raymond meant well, 3 words. I've turned them over many times since because they were doing far more work than they appeared to be. They weren't a defense of Raymond. They were a boundary marker. They were my father quietly telling me the exact distance at which he intended to stand, not beside me, not between me and Raymond, but somewhere to the side at a comfortable remove where he could observe both parties without committing to either. I said very little. I told him I'd heard him. I said I'd talk to him again soon. Then I put the phone down and stood in the hallway for a while, and I made a decision that I didn't announce to anyone and didn't explain to anyone. I decided not to respond to the thread. Not that day, not that week, not publicly. I decided to keep doing exactly what I had been doing before it appeared, writing, publishing, working, and to say nothing. I want to be honest about how that felt, because I don't want it to sound like a clean or confident decision. It was. There were evenings that week when I'd open my laptop to write and find myself opening the forum instead, scrolling through new comments, and I'd have to close the tab and walk around the block just to break the pull. I called 2 friends during those 12 days, one in Portland, one who lived 10 minutes from me, and told them both what was happening just to have somewhere to put it. Not to post about it anywhere. I just needed it to exist outside my own head. But I held the line on public silence. And the reason I was able to hold it was that I was holding something else at the same time, something I hadn't told anyone. This requires me to go back a few months. Around May or June of that year, I had started noticing a particular anonymous account engaging with my content in a way that felt slightly different from regular readers. More frequent, more substantive. The account would leave comments that engaged with the nuances of specific pieces, not fan responses, but the kind of reaction you get from someone genuinely wrestling with the material. Then in July, the same account sent a message through my contact form. It said that a piece I'd written about financial identity had genuinely shifted something in the way they thought about their relationship with money. And then it asked whether I offered any kind of one-on-one consulting. I responded. We exchanged 4 or 5 emails over a couple of weeks. At some point, the person, still anonymous to me then, mentioned they were working on a business proposal and asked if I'd be willing to review it professionally. They sent me a draft. I spent about 2 hours writing a detailed response, structural suggestions, a reframe of the central value proposition, some language they might consider for the executive summary. I sent it back. They thanked me. The conversation ended. Over the following weeks, through a small accumulation of details, the email domain, a phrase that matched something Raymond had said in passing at my dad's house, the specific industry the proposal was targeting, I had traced that anonymous account back to Raymond. Not with certainty at first. Enough certainty to go looking for confirmation and find it. So here is where things stood when his threat appeared. Raymond had publicly characterized my work as unsophisticated and unreliable. He had cost me partners, stalled my growth, and placed a question mark over my credibility in the exact community where my reputation mattered most. And he had done all of this while having privately told me that my writing had changed how he thought. While having asked me for my professional help, while having incorporated 3 of my specific suggestions, nearly verbatim, into the proposal he was actively pitching to investors. He did not know that I knew this. My father did not know that I knew this, and I chose not to use it, not yet. Not because I was being coldly strategic, though I understand why it might appear that way. More because I genuinely couldn't see what deploying it immediately would accomplish. It would have made me look reactive. It would have turned a story about Raymond's behavior into a story about a conflict between us, and in that story, neither of us would emerge clearly. I had been in enough situations by then to know that the person who fires first in public often loses control of the narrative fastest. So I kept it, and I waited. During those 12 days, my father called twice. Once on a Sunday afternoon, once on a Wednesday evening. I saw both calls. I did not pick up. This was not about punishing him, though I understand it may have felt that way. It was about not having a conversation I wasn't ready to have with full honesty. If I had picked up while still sitting inside the rawness of what I'd seen at that dinner table, I would have either said things I didn't fully mean or held back things I did. Neither version would have served what I actually wanted, which was a real conversation at a real moment, so I let it ring. Both times he didn't leave a voicemail. That told me something too. On the 14th day, I got a text from the collaborator who had gone quiet. He said he'd been rereading the thread and had some questions about the methodology. Could we connect? We talked for about 40 minutes. Somewhere in the middle of it, he said, "I think I reacted too fast. I'm sorry." I told him I appreciated that, and I meant it. And that same afternoon, though I wouldn't know the details until later, something was happening about 60 miles away that I had nothing to do with and could not have arranged. Raymond had been in conversations with an investor group based in Cincinnati. He desubmitted his proposal, the one built partly on my ideas, and they were in the due diligence phase, which is standard. Part of that process involved a researcher backgrounding all of the major sources Raymond had cited. This is routine work. Unglamorous, careful, and enormously consequential. The researcher found Raymond's forum thread. They found his public statements about the unreliability of independent content creators. They found my platform referenced in the bibliography of Raymond's own proposal. They read the platform. They compared what Raymond had written publicly about it to what it actually contained, and the two didn't align. And then, because Raymond had forwarded a portion of our email exchange to a colleague as documentation of the research process behind his proposal, those emails surfaced in the review. The investment meeting was canceled. Raymond called my dad that evening. My dad called me 30 minutes later. My phone lit up at 8:47 p.m. on a Thursday. I was on the couch with a book I wasn't really reading, a half-eaten bowl of leftover rice on the coffee table. I let it ring. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rings. On the 7th, I picked up. His voice was different. I want to describe it accurately because it wasn't what I'd expected. I had spent some of those 2 weeks quietly anticipating this call, turning over what it might sound like. Defensive, maybe, or that particular paternal register where explanation becomes its own form of authority. But it was neither. He sounded quieter than usual, like something had been removed from the room he was standing in. He didn't ask how I was, he said. I should have said something. Just that, no build-up, no architecture of justification, 4 words and a silence. I said, yes. He asked if we could talk. I told him yes, but not tonight. He said he understood, though his voice suggested he wasn't entirely sure that he did. Before he hung up, he said Raymond had called him and had asked specifically whether I had told anyone about the emails. I said, I didn't need to. There was a silence on the line, 5 seconds, maybe 6. More was communicated in that silence than in anything either of us had said. Then I said goodnight and put the phone down. I sat there for a while. The rice was cold. I put it in the fridge, went to bed earlier than usual, and slept better than I had in 2 weeks. 3 days later, I drove to his house on a Sunday afternoon. The trees had dropped most of their leaves by then, and the neighborhood had that bare, gray sky stillness that November brings to central Ohio. I parked in the driveway and sat in the car for 2 minutes before going in. Not rehearsing, I had deliberately not prepared anything, just breathing. He'd made coffee. We sat at the same dining room table where the dinner had happened 3 weeks earlier. Same chairs. Different quality of air, quieter, more honest, stripped of the social performance that 10 people and a formal table setting produce. Just him and me and the actual shape of what had happened between us. I didn't go in with a list. I didn't have notes. I'd spent years watching people enter difficult conversations armed and ready, and I'd noticed that armed people tend to produce armed responses, and you end up in a defensive loop where nobody is actually listening because everyone is waiting for their turn to speak. I went in with one question because I genuinely wanted the answer. I asked him, when Raymond was talking that evening, what were you thinking about? He looked at the table, then out the window, then back at me. And he said, and I want to be precise here because I've returned to this moment many times, he said he had been thinking about what Raymond would think of him if he intervened. He had been running a real-time calculation of what defending me would cost him socially. The number had come out too high, and so he hadn't paid it. Then he said, I wasn't thinking about you, I was thinking about myself. I nodded. I thanked him for being willing to say that out loud because I knew it wasn't easy. I told him that I had understood it in the moment, not consciously, not all at once, but in the body, the way you understand certain things before your mind catches up. That I'd spent the drive home and the 2 weeks afterward hoping I was wrong. That eventually you have to stop arguing with your own perception. He asked what I wanted from him. I thought about it. I told him I didn't want anything from him specifically, not an apology, not a gesture, not a performance of regret. What I wanted was something from the relationship going forward, and it was simple. If someone came for me in his presence again, I wanted him to say something. Not dramatically, not at great cost to himself, just enough to signal that I was worth a sentence. That was the whole ask. He said he could do that. I believed him. Not naively. I've known my father long enough to know that he is capable of meaning things and still not following through, and I've known myself long enough to know I can want to believe something past the point of evidence. But I also knew, sitting across from him in that quiet room, that what had shifted wasn't only his willingness to make a promise. What had shifted was the cost structure he was operating inside. Raymond had cost him something real, not a close friendship, perhaps, but credibility, and the specific kind of social capital that comes from being associated with someone who turns out to be operating dishonestly. The fear of Raymond's disapproval had lost most of its power, and without that fear, the calculation he'd been running unconsciously looked entirely different. I wasn't confused about whether this was a moral transformation. It wasn't entirely. But I've come to think the distinction between changed values and changed behavior matters less than people assume, because sustained changed behavior has a way of reshaping the person performing it. Habits are a form of architecture, and if the door to something more honest was open, I was going to walk through it. We talked for another hour. About his own father, his relationship with him, things I had never heard him describe in any detail before. About the networking group, about Raymond, about the specific kind of social environment where approval becomes a currency, and the cost of honesty always seems just slightly too high. At some point, he refilled both our coffees without asking. We sat there in the gray November light, and I think something genuinely shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way a room feels different after you open a window. In the weeks that followed, I heard through my dad that Raymond had approached him trying to understand what had happened with the investment. My dad had told him. The full sequence, the emails, the borrowed suggestions, the contradiction between Raymond's public criticism and his private behavior. I know this because my dad described it to me afterward without any particular satisfaction in his voice. He said Raymond had gone silent. I noticed and chose not to name that in his telling my dad had left out his own role at the dinner. The smile, the comfortable silence, the tacit permission of saying nothing. I didn't bring it up, not because it doesn't matter, but because some accounting has to wait for its right moment. He had done what I needed him to do in that specific moment, which was to tell Raymond an uncomfortable truth at personal cost. That was enough for that day. There is always more truth to arrive at. The skill is knowing which truth and when. People have asked me since what I took from all of this, and I always pause before answering, because the honest answer is less tidy than people want. There isn't a lesson that fits on a card. I understand now that people you love can fail you not from cruelty but from smallness, from the basic human unwillingness to absorb discomfort on someone else's behalf. That distinction matters enormously because cruelty and weakness require entirely different responses, and confusing them wastes a significant amount of your energy. My father was not a cruel man. He was a man who, in a specific moment, valued the temperature of the room over the welfare of his son. That's worth naming clearly, and it is, I think, repairable in a way that cruelty is not. I understand that public humiliation only holds power if you cooperate with its frame, if you accept the story someone else has written as the relevant story, and begin organizing your behavior around defending yourself within it. The moment I stopped viewing Raymond's thread as an attack requiring an answer and started viewing it as noise requiring patience, my relationship to it changed entirely. The work was still there. The 18,000 readers were still there. 3 years of consistent, honest effort were still there, accumulating quietly on their own behalf. I understand that the particular danger of building your self-worth through someone else's approval, especially a parent's, is that it makes your value dependent on a variable you don't control. I had spent years organizing myself, partly and unconsciously, around my father's regard. Not entirely. But enough that when I watched him choose comfort over me at that dinner table, what hurt most wasn't his failure in that moment. It was the sudden awareness of how much structural weight I had been placing on his opinion without ever realizing I was doing it. And I understand, Perhaps most practically of all, that silence is not weakness. Those 12 days were not passive. They were the most deliberately active choice I made in that entire period. Every day I didn't respond was a decision. Every hour I sat with the discomfort and kept working anyway was a decision. The pull to respond was almost physical some evenings, the kind of pressure that lives in your chest, not your head. But I kept returning to the same question. What outcome do I actually want here, the one that matters in 5 years? And every time I answered that honestly, the loud path led directly away from it. My father and I still talk. Not every week, sometimes every couple of weeks, sometimes with a longer gap. He came to a small meetup I organized last spring in Columbus, about 45 people from the platform, the first time the online community had gathered in a physical room. He sat near the back. He didn't introduce himself to anyone. He just listened. At the end of the evening, he found me near the door and he said, quietly, without ceremony, that he was proud of what I'd built. I thanked him. I meant it, and standing there with my jacket half on, the sound of people saying goodbye around us, I noticed that his saying it felt good but not necessary, like a bonus. Something that added to the evening without being the thing the whole structure depended on. That is the thing I kept from all of this. Not the platform recovering, it did fully within about 2 months. Not Raymond's exposure, which was real but which I've spent almost no time thinking about since. Not even the reconciliation with my father, as meaningful as that has been. The thing I actually kept was the discovery, made under pressure at some cost, that my value does not require a witness. There is a version of yourself that exists only in relation to other people's recognition of it. That version is always at risk, always one withdrawal away from collapse. It's the version most of us build first, because we're social creatures and approval is the earliest currency we're handed. But it is not the only version available. The other version, harder to build, slower to develop, quieter in its feedback, is rooted in the daily, often invisible act of doing work you believe in, measuring yourself against a standard you've set, and letting the accumulation of that effort produce its own evidence over time. That version doesn't need Raymond to validate it. It doesn't need my father to defend it. It doesn't need to win an argument. It just needs to outlast the noise. My father let the internet humiliate me. And 14 days later, the phone rang at 8:47 on a Thursday night, and I watched it ring 6 times before I picked up, because I needed him to sit inside the silence before I broke it. I have no regrets about those 6 rings, or the 12 days before them, or the conversation in the gray November light, or the relationship that has slowly, imperfectly rebuilt itself in the 18 months since. The only thing I would change, the one honest thing, is this. I would have stopped needing his approval sooner. Not because he doesn't love me, he does in the way he knows how. But I confused love with reliability for too long, and they are genuinely different things. Love is what someone feels. Reliability is what they do when the room gets uncomfortable and the cost of choosing you becomes real. I found out what I was made of in the space between those two things. It turned out to be more than I thought. And that, more than any of the rest of it, is the thing worth keeping.